I'm Edward Warfield, the publisher of CityBiz, and I'm honored today to interview Jan de Backer, who is the CEO of FLUIDDA. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Can you provide an introduction to your company, the employees, locations, your primary product?
Sure. So our company is called FLUIDDA. We started about 15 years ago. We started in Belgium, mainly looking at the respiratory space, trying to develop technology that would help treating the respiratory patients better. So we started in Belgium. We now have offices kind of across the world. So we're in LA, we're in New York, we're in Atlanta. We're still in Belgium. We're also in Lisbon, Portugal, and we have people in Singapore. We're still a small company, so we have about 35 people. And the reason we're a little bit spread out across the world is that we're doing a lot of clinical trials. And in clinical trials, you really need to be close to the hospitals that participate in those trials. So that's why we have our teams across the globe, which in this world with Teams and Zoom meetings, it's not a huge issue anymore. It has its challenges, but it's still something that works quite well.
And can you explain the complexity of lung diseases and the current state of sort of diagnostic capabilities?
I think we're just coming out of, or maybe we're still in a respiratory pandemic. So I think people have experienced the complexities of lung diseases firsthand. And the problem with lung disease is that it's, first of all, pretty hard to diagnose them. Many of the lung diseases are only diagnosed in a very late stage. And the reason for that is that your lung has a remarkable capability of compensating for disease. So it could be that certain parts of the lung are already affected by a disease, such as asthma or COPD, which is often caused by smoking. But your typical lung function, at least the way we measure today, still not reflects an abnormality. So what we do in terms of our imaging is really opening up the black box and looking at the regional parts of the lung with these quantification methods, so to really to understand better what the true extent of the disease is. And that's I think something in COVID which was quite apparent in the beginning. We didn't really know what the disease was doing. So why were these people on ventilators dying at such a high rate? And I think we got more and more insights in that over the last couple of years.
And so, what are the weaknesses of conventional CT scans?
So, as probably most people know, so the conventional way of assessing a CT scan is having a radiologist literally visually scroll through the two-dimensional images. So they're looking for abnormal patterns. And they usually spend about 3 to 5 minutes looking at a CT scan and then providing the report. So it's quite a subjective measure. If you ask 5 radiologists to look at the same image, they will probably all come up with slightly different interpretation of the same image. And it's not very scalable. So you don't still linked to individuals. And there are certain features that you also cannot see with the naked eye. So, to give you an example, what was quite obvious, especially in the COVID patients, is that the way, for instance, that the blood volume is distributed over the different generations of your blood vessels. So, your blood vessels in the lung is really a bifurcating system. And if you're healthy, it kind of follows a more normal exponential curve. If you're diseased, then you start seeing shifts away from that curve. But that's something you cannot see with the naked eye because it's a really a 3D phenomenon. And that's where advanced quantitative methods start playing increasingly a role to provide information that's hidden in plain sight, if you will, which is not possible to detect just by looking at it, which typically a radiologist would do.
And so, can you explain what functional respiratory imaging is?
Yeah, so that's the technology we've been developing over the last 15 years. So my background is in aerospace engineering. So I'm an aerospace engineer by training. And in that world, we use computers to simulate flows around wings, engines, etc. And my father is a respiratory physician. So 15 years ago in Belgium, so it's kind of cool. You can use computers to simulate flows. Can you also simulate the flow in the lungs? I said, yeah, it's kind of cool, but why would you want to do that? And he said, yeah, I'm part of the EMA, so I have to assess how well drugs are working. But with the conventional endpoints, the conventional lung function tests, it's really hard to understand what is really going on. So maybe if we combine methods from aerospace engineering with the typical CT scans with the medical imaging, we could develop technology that does two things. One, provide better insights into the lung diseases themselves so that we can have a better idea of what part of the lungs are affected by asthma or IPF, which is pulmonary fibrosis, or COVID 19, etc. And the other part is if we provide a treatment or if we develop a treatment and we use the technology as a way to assess what happens in those lungs, we can probably have a better matching of the right patient with the right treatment. And that is a technology that we now call functional respiratory imaging. So it's functional because it uses these methods from aerospace engineering looking at flow behavior. It's respiratory because we focus on the respiratory system, and it's imaging because it uses the CT scans, the typical medical imaging modality.
And so, what is the potential impact on asthma and other respiratory diseases, and what is its impact on drug development?
So as I said before, the problem with lung diseases is that often you detect them in a quite late stage. Whether it's the effects of smoking or whether it's asthma or exposure to toxins in the air, like we've seen with servicemen in burn pit environments, etc. So the problem is that you detect it too late if you just go by the conventional endpoints. So what functional respiratory imaging does, it allows you to detect it at an earlier stage. And one thing that all the lung diseases have in common, or virtually all of them, they're all pretty much irreversible. So once you lose your lung function, you hardly ever get it back. So if you have a way to detect earlier whether there's something's going on and you can stop it, then you can also make sure the patient stays at a higher level of lung function, lung capacity for a longer period of time, which is associated with better quality of life, etc. The same thing is true for the drugs that we're developing now. If you only can detect decline in a later stage, almost by default, you're only going to develop drugs that are targeted towards the late stage of the disease. So you're always kind of trailing the facts. So if you have more sensitive technology, you can intervene earlier. You can study drugs and drug effects in an earlier stage of the disease. And the other advantage is that if you use a more sensitive approach, if you just take a picture of the lungs rather, instead of relying on derivative measurements, you can reduce the sample size and the duration of your clinical trials quite substantially. So you can study the drug with fewer patients in a shorter period of time. So you can, in the end, also develop better drugs and bring them to market faster.
And so, what role is machine learning playing in your technology?
So machine learning is, of course, something that you hear about almost on a daily basis. It's pretty much everywhere. So we're using AI and machine learning in several aspects of the technology. So one part is to improve the extraction of the information from the CT scan. So part of the AI approach is where you have so-called labeled scans. So for instance, if you have a CT scan, originally you had individuals kind of coloring, labeling, whether it's an airway or a blood vessel or fibrosis, etc. So that's the input for machine learning. It's the input for deep learning, which are artificial intelligence approaches, where the machine kind of learns how to do it themselves. So instead of having individuals kind of do the manual processing, the machine can take over more and more and do quite an accurate job, which makes it all automatic. So it's almost an instantaneous processing now, where when we started 15 years ago, it took about probably a week to process a patient. Now it's a matter of minutes. So that's where AI and machine learning comes into play. Another element is machines are very good at bringing a lot of different types of information together and make an assessment. So the machine can, for instance, look at the vasculature, the airways, the lung volume, the fibrosis, use all that information and make an interpretation assessment, where usually humans kind of look at one element at a time. So radiologists would scroll through the image, mainly look at abnormal patterns, and then make a decision in 3 to 5 minutes, but disregard, as I said before, blood vessel characteristics or characteristics of the airways, etc. So that's where AI and machine learning comes in, and they can enhance the performance of the physician. Just to make clear, AI will not replace the physicians, but the physicians that use AI will probably replace the physicians that don't. So that's where I think the current status is.
And how many clinical centers have been trained worldwide on it?
So I think we're at about 300 now. So about 300 centers have been trained to mainly participate in the clinical trials, and we project that number to go up to about 500 in the next 12 to 18 months.
And let's go back to when the company was spun out of the University of Antwerp. Tell us, yeah, how did that happen, and what role you played in orchestrating that?
So, as I said before, we started the company in Belgium in 2005. So, my father was a professor at the University of Antwerp in the Department of Respiratory Medicine. And at that time, especially in Belgium, spin off companies weren't there weren't so many spin-off companies around. So the university was quite interested in seeing whether this technology could be commercially useful and could lead to something which was a sustainable company, which after 15 years we're still around, we're growing. So it seems that we're onto something. But that was the early days where indeed it was a translation from, let's say, more of the research or the initial testing phase into something which turned out to be commercially viable.
And so, yeah, you've been CEO for 15 years. Can you share some of the milestones over those 15 years?
Yeah, sure. There were, luckily, there were a good number of those. I think in different areas, right? So one of the milestones I think was 2012 when we decided to go into the what still is the biggest market, healthcare market, the U.S. market. So we started our U.S. office in 2012 in New York. So that was definitely a milestone. Which I moved together with that office. So that was also for me a milestone where kind of the environment changed. So moving to the US, I'm a green card holder now, so it's built the at least the part of my future was changing at that point in time. So that was for sure a big milestone. I think the further geographical expansion with Singapore and Portugal kind of followed on from that. Um, I think from a content perspective, I think if you have your first repeat customer, that is something which is a milestone where you see, okay, you're doing something that actually is valuable because they come back. You probably can convince everybody to try it once, but companies that come back that validate your approach, and we're happy to say that the vast majority of our customers come back for other studies, for new projects, etc. The hospitals we work with, they're quite intrigued. So that's another milestone. And I would say the last couple of years, COVID has been, of course, a huge. It's a curse and a blessing, of course. Nobody likes to go through a pandemic, but at the same time, it also made everybody realize that we kind of need to do better in respiratory medicine. And I think we were kind of unprepared. And I think just having the debate on why did we have to shut down literally the entire world because we could not deal with a respiratory pandemic, I think there's more room for that debate now. And we're happy to kind of contribute to that and see if we can provide some of the solutions. But that for sure was a milestone for us as a company. But I think it was a milestone for everybody on earth. So the fact that that kind of collides provides opportunities. So I think that's definitely something that in the course of our history as a company was a milestone.
So in 2020, the FDA provided market clearance for the Broncholab platform. Tell us about that and the implications for the company.
So since the beginning, we were mainly active in clinical trials, where we worked for pharma companies, medical device companies. So that's a business model which is fairly straightforward. It's a kind of a business to business approach, where they use the technology to really assess the efficacy of their drugs or devices. Um, at that point in time, the CT scans were still fairly high dose. It was not that easy to get one. Over the last couple of years, the radiation dose for CT scans has gone down dramatically. It's more accessible now. So we felt that momentum was turning. So in I think 2018, 2019, we decided to start developing applications for the hospitals on top of what we were doing for the clinical trials and the pharmaceutical companies. So Broncholab was, and the clearance of Broncholab was the result of a development where now we can use this as a so-called medical device in the hospital sector. So that means that individual physicians can send us the CT scans, we can analyze them, and they can use it on an individual basis, on an individual patient basis, without the need to be part of a clinical trial. So that was for one of the first clearances. We now also cleared in Europe. So it opens up the market, the hospital market for these type of applications, where the first ones are cleared, but there are several under development that we feel will add significant value in the hospital space with individual patients and physicians.
And can you share how the company's been funded to date, and what are your funding goals in the next couple of years?
So interestingly, we've been growing organically for a long time. So about the first 13 years, we were able to grow the company and develop the company based on the revenue that was we generated within those clinical trials. It was 2019 that we had an initial seed round where we used the money to really prepare our products for the hospital business. So the Broncholab that we just discussed, we raised some money for that. And now we're in our Series A, so we are going out to the markets, raising money to further develop applications, to scale up, to have more people approaching the physicians, because it really is, and I think that's where a lot of value can be created. Healthcare is very siloed. You probably experienced that as a patient. If you go to one doctor, they might refer you to another, but there's very little, yeah, links between the silos. And that's the thing in pulmonary medicine. Pulmonary medicine and radiology historically didn't interact too often. So in this case, you have to show the pulmonologist or cardiologist what medical imaging can do, such that they will request more CT scans to do the assessment on. Because if they just go by the visual interpretation by the radiologist, that's only a fraction of what is in those images. So it is a little bit of an information campaign, an educational effort to go out to individual physicians and show them what is possible. Because you can show what the technology does, but the next thing they say is that, okay, I like it, I like the images, I like the pictures, but how does that make me treat the patient better? So it's not just enough to say, here's new technology. In healthcare, you really have to link it to improved clinical outcomes. And that's something that we're increasingly doing now. That's something we are raising money for, is to generate that evidence, to be able to go out to the physicians and inform them what the technology can do. So that's and that we believe that will significantly increase our growth rate over the next couple of years, because I think the field is ready to adopt more medical imaging in the respiratory space, especially if it's driven by AI and if it's built on a solid foundation of 15 years of research where the focus is on improving the clinical outcomes. So we're quite optimistic about the next couple of years, and we're looking forward to bringing the technology closer and closer to the patient.
So it's a question that I'm going to ask that's not part of the questions that I gave you in advance. So as you were telling me your story, I think an important part of the story is really your father's role and your relationship with him, and just give us some background. It's obviously a fascinating combination, father son, and talk a little bit about uh, your father and his role in this, and the you know the your relationship with him in terms of the company. So
Absolutely. No, I think it's probably one of the most rewarding parts of building the company is that we brought together these two disciplines. And if you read the book, for instance, the Medici effect is it's all about how to create innovation. And today in this world, it's kind of hard to create more innovation within a specific department, within a specific silo. But just the mere fact that we brought together these two disciplines, I think, created opportunities. And an important element, of course, in innovation and pretty much in running companies is trust. And if you have the trust because you have a family bond, that opens up a lot of possibilities. And I think the reason we got so far is because we haven't had that trust in the past, which kind of allowed us to focus on core businesses without having to deal with either trust or building trust or getting to know each other. You can start at a let's say a higher level. It's not, of course, not always easy because it is conflates everything, and you kind of have to somewhat be able to separate the business from the family at some point in time. But we managed to do that quite well. The fact that he's also still actively seeing patients and using the technology in his clinical practice is of tremendous value, because he's kind of the source where we see, okay, what works, what doesn't work, how can we improve. So all that is a big part of the success. So it's been quite rewarding on different levels of business, but also the personal level. So that's definitely a takeaway from that story.
And so, what are the growth plans for the company?
So as I said before, I think there's tremendous opportunity there. We will continue, of course, to do our clinical trial work. We get a lot of requests from pharma companies, medical device companies to participate in their trials to kind of help design or optimize their drugs. And I think the big opportunity is in making sure that technology is being used more efficiently in the hospitals. And there we kind of target fairly broad range of hospitals. Of course, you have the academic research centers, but we see a lot of use for the technology also in the specific cardiopulmonary rehabilitation environments. Because there's a lot of patients now that suffer from the consequences of COVID. So we see a lot of very young people, 30, 35, that have extreme fatigue, where it's hard to know exactly what's going on. And if they have a CT scan, they all come with a radiology report saying, okay, everything looks normal. But if we then measure these scans with the technology, we see that it's not normal. There are still abnormalities that are not apparent with the visual eye or with the naked eye, but they're still there. So that's where the technology in that setting can be useful, so you can guide the patient towards the more optimal cardiopulmonary rehabilitation program. And what we've seen so far, and I think we've done maybe 10, 20, 30 patients, there's pretty much improvement in virtually all of them. So you can give these patients hope, because it's that pivotal point where either the medical space or the medical world provides you with hope as a patient, or they don't, and then often it's a negative spiral. It's people get depressed, they don't even go to the doctor or cannot even get an appointment, so they get even more depressed. So we're hopeful that in a technology driven environment, a healthcare environment, we can provide care and improve clinical outcome in a very efficient way. And that's kind of what we're trying to do. I think we have to turn the tables a little bit to make sure that we somewhat um, build a system bottom up, but technology driven and data driven, and have healthcare professionals work in that environment. And I think it'll be a nice environment for patients to come to improve further medically. And I think that's where the growth lies. So a technology driven, bottom up, data driven environment, I think that's the future in healthcare. We like to contribute to that to the extent that we can.
So, you've started a new blog that brings surfing and chess. Tell us about the origins of that, and tell us about some of your topics that you've written about.
Yes, I think at one point in time, I'd say about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I was thinking about what are the characteristics that over the last 15 years seem to be important as a, let's say, an entrepreneur to have in order to at least be able to stick around in healthcare and hopefully be increasingly successful. And what I came up with was that you kind of have to have two hats. One, you need to be a surfer and you need to be a chess player. And the surfer kind of points towards the more of the macro environment. So everything in healthcare kind of moves fairly slow. But if the wave is coming, you need to be on there. So you kind of need to feel whenever the wave comes as a surfer that you can actually catch the wave when it presents itself. Because if you start pedaling too fast, you miss it. And if you start pedaling too late, it's also gone and you have to wait for the next one. So these are things that are not under your control as an entrepreneur, but you have to feel where the environment is heading. Once you're in the wave, once you have the momentum, you have to see, okay, where are the other players moving towards? So what elements do I have under control? And that's where you become a little bit of a chess player to see, okay, what are the next steps that I can envision? What are the next step towards hopefully winning the game, or at least making advances there. So that's kind of the setup for the blog, and the blog thereby then looks for examples of innovation in healthcare that again tries to connect the silos and see, okay, where does technology fit in to the overall healthcare environment, and where we also create content in terms of having interviews with, for instance, last week we interviewed a general from the National Guard who developed lung diseases during their time in Afghanistan by inhaling probably toxic fumes from those burn pits, etc. So it's those, and at the same time, the person was somewhat, I would say, frustrated with the conventional healthcare system simply because they didn't get to the bottom of it. She was categorized as having asthma, which is probably partially true. But it's those stories, I think, especially people that have served the country, that are putting their lives or their health on the line to serve others. I think those are good cases to show where technology could hopefully help them and make sure that they stay stable, hopefully improve, etc. So that's part of the blog, to bring those stories more to life, put some spotlight on it, to make sure that everybody knows that technology can do a lot in the healthcare space, and particularly in the respiratory space.